Hi, welcome to Political Perspectives. I'm Cynthia Dickstein. Our topic today is the new Scramble for Africa. The original Scramble for Africa took place in the late 19th century when Britain, France, and Germany competed to carve Africa into colonies. Today, Britain and France are again among the biggest competitors in Africa, along with China and the U.S., all seeking influence and profit. Should the U.S. focus on development aid and investing in Africa? Does Africa matter to U.S. foreign policy? And if so, why? With us to discuss this, we have two distinguished guests, each of whom bring extensive and impressive experience in Africa, primarily in Nigeria and Uganda. Ted Downing, professor of social development at the University of Arizona, was elected to 2 terms as a member of the Arizona House of Representatives, representing Central Tucson. Ted received his PhD at Stanford and has worked in 16 countries, focusing on assuring that people and communities in the way of mega development projects are not harmed. Professor Downing has served as consultant on social development to the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation, Inter-American Development Bank, and the African Development Bank. Currently, he is a fact finder for the World Bank Inspection Panel, against an oversight office that hears public complaints against bank projects and reports directly to the board of the World Bank. Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome, Ted. Leslye Obiora, our second guest, recently served as the Executive Cabinet Minister for Mines for the Government of Nigeria and presently teaches at the University of Arizona Law College. She obtained her professional degree from the University of Nigeria and her graduate degrees from Yale and Stanford Law Schools. Professor Obiora has published extensively on several matters, including human rights, gender equity, and development, and she is the founder of the Institute for Research on African Women, Children, and Culture. She has received several awards for her service and scholarship, and in 2008 she will be a visiting faculty member at Yale University. In November 2006, delegates from nearly 50 African countries were in Beijing for a weekend summit, the largest China-Africa gathering since the 1949 founding of Communist China. Professor Obiora was one of those delegates. Professor, welcome.
Thank you.
And can you begin our discussion with, by talking about the significance of that summit?
I think in many ways it did signify Africa's continuing relevance and also the resource hunger that abounds in the world today, and the problems that come with that, of course, stand to reason. And I'm hoping that by the time I'm done, that myself and Ted will shed some more light on that. But at the end of the Cold War, there was a lot of enthusiasm for the opening up of societies in Africa, and the end of the Cold War was thought to have signified some kind of a watershed for democracy and development, and the peace dividend, so-called, that it was supposed to have brought. Unfortunately, with time, it seemed like the giddiness that came with that quickly faded. And both those who were proponents of the peace dividend and those who were supposed to be the implementers of the peace dividend, to wit the African governments, became very wary of each other. And for a while, it seemed like Africa had no relevance whatsoever. With China's increasing growth came a resurgence of hunger for commodities, hence their interest and their focus in Africa. But China is not just interested in Africa's commodities. It has extended aid, it has brought a lot of investment, it has brought a lot of infrastructural development, building roads and bridges that would, of course, facilitate its interventions in Africa. The reservations that people have about that are also quite extensive. Indeed, there was a Newsweek, or was it The Economist, one of the newspapers had written a piece talking about how China knows what it wants from Africa, but does Africa know what it wants? And I think at the end of the day, one thing that I want to do is provide a perspective that does humanize Africa and steer us away, in a sense, from this kind of objectification that I think underlies the vulnerabilities of Africa to scrambles and other forms of exploitations.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Ted, do you want to talk about your personal experiences? You were recently in Nigeria and Uganda to evaluate a West African gas pipeline project and to study a private power generation project, correct?
Yes.
Do you want to talk about how you are personally involved in development?
Right. I've had many roles, but my current role is to work as a fact finder for a group called the Inspection Panel, which is a small group reporting directly to the board of the World Bank. When citizens complain that something's going wrong with a World Bank project or one of the development projects, in this case, the citizens can send a complaint directly to the Inspection Panel, not to the bank itself. And then they send fact finders. We interview the government, private companies. We interview, of course, the people that have complained. In the case of Nigeria, there was a complaint primarily from Yoruba, which are a large tribe in the southwestern part of Nigeria, that a new gas pipeline, which will be going through their area off to Benin, Togo, and Ghana, underwater, but it crosses over land, that they had been undercompensated and been treated improperly by the companies, and this was Chevron, Shell, Texaco. So I went in and investigated that. In Uganda, very interesting case, Uganda is energy starved. They're building their second dam, and this second dam was located right on top of a major princely spirit of the Basoga tribe. Conflicts have broken out over its cultural importance, and more importantly, there's a question underlying whether Lake Victoria, which feeds the Nile, has enough water to even let this dam work. So we were invited in at the request of some environmental groups to look, and cultural people, to look at that complaint. So my job is fact-finding. I report back not to the bank, but to the board itself.
Have you found that the World Bank has a renewed interest more recently in Africa than, say, 10 years ago, as Leslye was addressing?
I think the World Bank has not put Africa on the front burner. And we just had a report just came out on world agriculture in Africa, the investment in agriculture, which is a serious issue. Most African people are agriculturalists. Is something like 600 million. That's even like half the budget of the University of Arizona. That's for the entire continent. Certainly, the technical staff, there's 10,000 people working in the bank. Only 17 are dedicated to African agriculture. So no, the priorities haven't been put there, and part of it is the capacity of, from their point of view, the capacity of Africa to absorb more loans.
Okay. The interesting thing is that in an institution that has over 12,000 employees, it's 17 experts or technical experts, only 17, and yet they can talk about the lack of capacity in Africa. I think in a sense that China's growing involvement and competition does spur the World Bank and institutions like that to gain greater interest. The World Bank is foremost a bank, a lending institution. It has lending limits. So meager though its budget for Africa may be, it still has to meet its limits. So when it has competition from China, you can imagine that it would still want to be able to disburse the loans that it has already set aside for Africa. But the bigger question for me is really, in all of this, I know that some of the commentators and analysts that were talking about the China-Africa Summit were concerned about China's so-called policy of non-interference, which was actually what the World Bank started off with, that they would not interfere in the political or internal affairs of the governments that they deal with, and China at this inception stage seems to have that policy. And the understanding or the perception is that African leaders are embracing China to a greater extent because they are sick and tired of ideological and double standard prescriptions from the World Bank, which sort of proposes accountability and transparency and due process and good governance without holding itself up to the same standards as well. At the end of the day, if you really have to talk about Africa's agency and why Africa seems to be perpetually vulnerable to these scrambles and re-scrambles and new scrambles or whatnot, you really have to wonder about how to strengthen the institutions that would help Africa be much more prepared for its own self-determination. And that's really where my interest lies.
Let me just interrupt. It's not just the World Bank, by the way. It's the World Trade Organization and the IMF, the International Money Fund, as well, isn't it? Who are all involved.
And there's regional. The African Development Bank is
the
international development agencies.
And I know that there's a big debate in this country about the benefits of foreign aid, not just in Africa, but anywhere, versus privatizing and private investment. Did you want to, Ted, address that?
I think there is, and I think I'd like to say something first about China. The question is not, and I think it's a good question, what does Africa want out of China? But when countries or financial institutions put money into areas, there's strings attached. The strings attached are first and foremost to make certain that the money is repaid. But there's other strings attached, and the difference between China and the more free world financial intermediaries is in many ways the environmental and social restrictions. A policy of non-interference, which China is doing, is a way of saying we're going to put the money in and we don't care what happens. From the point of view of the little nascent groups that are fighting for human rights, social rights, and for environmental rights in Africa, that's a very scary situation. With the World Bank and the African Development Bank and the European Community, they have attached to their loans what they're called safeguard policies, which are ways to make certain that the environment has certain protections, that people that are near these projects have certain protections which are very destructive, including for HIV, with 7,000 men coming into an area, usually very small tribal areas, extremely dangerous for the women, the local women. They have social safeguards that if you're in the way and your property is taken as part of a project, do you become a beneficiary? So those social safeguards of my concern, they're attached to the conditions of these loans when they're coming in from the World Bank, from the African Development Bank. China is not attaching those conditions. So non-interference can be a backward door. This isn't Star Trek, where you move in and you don't touch the local culture. There's an attempt, as Leslye just said, to build institutions. Now, sometimes the bank staff goes overboard thinking they know what's right for Africa in terms of governance. That's where they call us in.
This is where your experience as Minister of Mines comes in, because you witnessed and were part of a lot of obstacles to development in Nigeria.
Yeah, I mean, I think the sad commentary is really, again, as I said, the objectification of Africa and the fact that we are so institution-starved and so leadership-challenged that, it's the East and the West that are talking above our heads about us. So that when we complain about paternalism and stuff like that, you still have to wonder at the end of the day, who is in charge? Are these sovereign nations that we're dealing with, what accounts for their sovereignty, and how can they assert such sovereignty? The safeguard conditionalities that Ted mentions are indeed noble. They were hard-won gains. But unfortunately, there is a wide gap between the theory or the principle and the practice or the implementation. So here you have the World Bank, for instance, in my own experience, really double-speaking. On paper, they have brilliant ideas about due process and transparency. They are the ones then who are supposed to facilitate the implementations of these. But they also have ways that they circumvent the implementations of these, so that at the end of the day, it's a mockery of the whole situation. Listen, I am an African. I am not as impoverished, in terms of capacities or competences as Africa is portrayed. I mean, it's portrayed as some perpetual pathology. The question is, how do you help catalyze the agencies of the likes of me, of the leaders? How do you support, in reality, the kinds of institutions, the kind of structures and processes that would ensure indeed that the vacuum of sanctions that make for the kind of opportunistic behaviors like corruption and so on and so forth really gives Africa a break? It's not China's obligation. It's not the World Bank's obligation. It is Africa's primary obligation to be self-determining. How do we equip Africa for such self-determination? And what's the role of the World Bank?
And I think she's absolutely correct. One of the things I've discovered in my work in Africa, of course, is the immense capacity, intellectual capacity, of the African leaders. I mean, some of the best economics I've read comes out of Nigerian economists, which are very, very good. But the underlying issue is, and I think that the game is a little complicated here, because people that are in particular countries that are receiving loans, civil sector advocates, people pushing for the environment, use these policies from the outside and say, these are not being followed, we need protection. So these become like shields. On the other hand, the paternalism is immense. I was in Uganda. We had a meeting of people that had forcibly resettled. All the women were sitting over in one group on the ground. You know how it happens. All the men were standing over here testifying and to us. And at one point, the topic was that what was going to happen to the houses that they'd been given. They had cracks. And so there were discussions, was the bank going to bring in people to fix them and all this kind of stuff. At one point, we asked the question, how would you like to learn to fix those houses yourself? And the men jumped up and said, we will. And then at that point I said, and what if we actually trained women to fix the houses? And you know that sound, which I can't make, that sound incredible. Screaming and yelling coming from the women's section, absolutely ready to gain this capacity to fix their own homes, as opposed to a more paternalistic thing, hire a contractor, have them go in, fix the homes, the profits made, and the people sat there without the capacity.
And the interesting thing is, you give the loan, Africa mortgages its future, you determine who is going to, be the consultants and who is going to be the contractors. And Africa ends up fueling, some kind of employment for your own people, as opposed to transferring the skills and building the capacities locally. But going back to your question about my experience as minister, I just want to give 3 quick anecdotes. One was one that I actually brought to Ted's attention. I fought very hard to facilitate the promulgation of a mining legislation, which is the bedrock for the revitalization of our mining sector. The World Bank had proposed that what we should do is allow the Mining Cadastre Office, which is the licensing officer, to be the one to issue the licenses. Our legislature, the Senate, looked at it and said, no, that the minister should actually be the ultimate authority on this issue. And it turned out that some entrenched interests still wanted the Mining Cadastre Office, which is a civil service bureaucrat, to have final say-so. And they tried to change the law that the legislation had already passed. The World Bank blinked at this. And guess what? The new administration has come after I have left office. And guess what they've done? They've revoked the licenses that have been given. And there is a lot of anxiety in the investment community about what this portends for their investment. We want to attract investors into Nigeria, yet we take one step backwards, we take another step, forward, and so on and so forth. Why? Because APETA, the agencies such as the World Bank, keep playing these kinds of games that are not.
She's absolutely right. Who in Arizona, which we have a big mining interest, would like to go work in Nigeria, knowing that in one day they give you a license, the next day they take it away? This is poor advice on the part of the bank.
One of the questions I want to bring up, because it has to do with the World Bank and other investors, is that one of the criticisms that they get all the time, what I hear, is that they extend loans that they know the nations can't pay. Then the nations are indebted to them, and then they go in and have a guaranteed source of natural resources and cheap labor. And that is, I think, the anti-globalization, their protests, what that's based on. Has that happened?
I can tell you up front that we did not, my sector, the mining sector, did not need the $120 million loan that we took from the World Bank. Okay, I wasn't privy to the negotiation of the loans, but I can also tell you that the assets were woefully squandered. At some point, I suspended the loan because I thought that these were loans that were extended to Nigeria, that they were not petty cash facilities, and that was what they were being used as. And I thought, how could our children tomorrow be obligated to pay out for these loans that were just being used just as petty cash, which we could fund from our own overheads, okay? Secondly, there was a contract that was advertised for a geological survey for $10 million. Less than 10 months later, I wasn't also there when the contract was advertised. Less than 10 months later, it was approved. There was a winner who won the bid. And I was told that the contract had to be varied so that it was no longer $10 million, which was what was advertised, but $25 million. And my question was, how do you account for an inflation of such a magnitude? and they said it was rise in petroleum and so on and so forth. So they really, when you talk about accountability and transparency and due process and so on and so forth, maybe it's Greek to me, but the way I experienced it, you know, trying to run this sector with all the people telling me, a lawyer of how many years standing, you know, what just plain English means, and making it, and mystifying it to me, really made me wonder about what it would take for Africa to take control of its own destiny.
One of the other criticisms, and you'd be good to address this, or both of you, that I've heard is that in Africa, that some of this money, in spite of all the safeguards there, goes to the leaders. And that the leaders spend the money on, not necessarily on social projects, but other things, sometimes for their own benefit. And that the populace sees that the way to go to be prosperous is to go into the government, not to go into private business. And so the people in America who are against foreign aid, who are saying it doesn't work, are saying that there's not enough push for private entrepreneurship there, that the aid is taking that away. Is that something you found?
Yeah, and I think first is, for God's sakes, don't give up on people because there's a few corrupt ones. I mean, no, right. That's the, I mean, you've got to have enough faith to believe that, as you said, that you have the local capacity for people to develop. And but the situation in Africa, and I think and let's just go to corruption first. The dam that I'm working on, the Bujagali Dam, which is right north of Lake Victoria, where it empties into the Nile. They had planned a second dam. That dam stopped. It's been stopped for 4 years. Why? Because the company that was building it, which had a sole source, by the way, contract with the bank, the owner of the company was introduced to the president of Uganda by the Clintons at a party. And guess what? We now have ourselves a dam being built. Well, unfortunately, that company found itself giving bribes to a person who happened to be an executive director of the World Bank, one of the people on the board. Big scandal, dam stopped, person resigns, and all this. Now, with that kind of issue of corruption, as she said, it's very hard. But this doesn't mean that the overall purpose is gone. You've got to ferret out. That's my job. My job is to make certain these projects get back on track. And as long as people will complain, and as long as the civil sector is active and step forward and say, we think these things are happening, and we welcome complaints. And once those complaints are made, believe me, what happens isn't very pretty, because we have the capacity to open up a lot of doors to find out what's going on. And we go back to the board, there's 24 of them from all over the world, we tell them what's happening. And at that point, actually what we do, we tell them ahead of time, we tell management, you have 60 days to listen to what we think happens. They can straighten it out, usually they do.
I can tell you that I have a lot of cases I'm going to point to you, Ted, because the bank, when you talk about corruption, we also should talk about corruption within the bank. It's not a problem that's unique to Africa. And when you talk about foreign aid, what percentage of wealth here goes to foreign aid? I'm told some figures say it's about 1% or so. Even if it's just, even if it's less than that, the most important thing is that it accomplished the purpose for which it was sent. And the bank is just as complicitous in corruption in Africa.
I agree there's problems, and just so you'll know, Cynthia, I filed the first 3 human rights charges ever made against the World Bank, which got me blackballed for a few years before I came back as an investigator.
I know that we could follow this track, but I don't want to focus. We have less than 5 minutes left, and I don't want to focus on corruption. I want to focus on Africa's natural resources, because they're so plentiful, and how that affects U.S. foreign policy, especially oil. So do one of you want to address that?
Having been the Minister for Mines and Steel Development in Nigeria, on the heels of what's going on in the Niger Delta, where there is a backlash against socially insensitive forms of development and forms of development that raped communities, I really think that part of the emphasis should be placed on ensuring that history does not repeat itself, especially with the development and stewardship of mineral resources. And unfortunately, what I see going forward does not make me very optimistic that we are not going to repeat that kind of history that disenfranchises the communities at the end of the day, that really makes those communities bear the brunt of the extraction, but enjoy nothing of the benefits of the extraction. And at the end of the day, it just means that they're going to hold the whole process hostage. What is the role of superpowers like the United States in ensuring that for as long as they have some kind of a stake in the process, that it's actually gotten right from the start, as opposed to playing some games?
Yeah, I think the game may not have changed at all. China, United States, all these countries are looking at Africa for their non-renewable resources in mining, oil, extraction. That has been moving on in every scramble to look at Cynthia. But it's time to realize that the strength of Africa, as Leslye said, is in its people. When you invest in people, you invest in education, you invest in the capacity to people to have sustainable governments. When you invest in transparency, accountability, then Africa can become part of the community of nations in the same, and consume all the junk we consumed in the United States. I shouldn't say that, but they can join and have the same access. In Uganda, only 5% of the people have electricity. I watched most children and women in Uganda carry water. That's what they do all day long. That is an enormous waste of human capacity. They can't go to school because the kids are carrying water. I mean, this is 2008. Isn't it time to get past this?
I think that's a good place to stop, because we have run out of time. And I want to thank Professor Obiora,
thank you,
Professor Downing. I think you felt that we could have gone on for a lot longer, both of you.
By the way, I want you to know we're professors, but we're very active.
Okay. I can tell.
Okay.
And I want to, again, thank you very much. And I want to leave everyone with us with a quote by Booker T. Washington, the African-American leader and educator who was born in 1856 and died in 1915. And he said, "Remember that everyone's life is measured by the power that individual has to make the world better. This is all life is." Thanks again for joining us. It was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I told you it went very quickly, didn't it?